Greetings, this is Mary Jane Hayden, and today I'm going to tell you about the changes we made to FDM 210, which is the chapter on arterials and collectors. Before we dive into the updates for the 2020 FDM, I want to point something out. Just to make sure we all know how to quickly spot where a change has been made in the FDM, look for the black vertical bars on the side of the page. These bars may be on either the right or the left side of the page, just depending on whether you're looking at an even or an odd numbered page. Since the document was set up as if you're looking at a book, the vertical lines appear on what would be the outside of that page. So whenever you see one of these lines, that's the indication that some sort of change has been made. So the first change I want to tell you about in this chapter is the elimination of some of the modification for non-conventional projects boxes, or as we call them here, blue boxes. Over the past year, we went through and reevaluated every single blue box in the entire FDM to determine whether or not it was really necessary. The blue boxes were introduced back in 2013 to clarify criteria and phase submittal requirements for conventional and non-conventional projects. Some of the blue boxes that are in the FDM have been in there since 2013 and they've been unchanged. As our knowledge of non-conventional projects has grown, we identified the need to reevaluate all of the blue boxes to determine what was really necessary to remain and also what was needed to be revised. So you may see where some blue boxes have been removed or revised, and that's a result of this effort. The next change to look at is a new section for existing on-street parking. It was brought to our attention this past year that we needed to address how to handle existing on-street parking. Before we go diving into the new language, though, let me give you a little bit of history behind our on-street parking requirements. If you were to look back at the department's history of this, you'd find that prior to the FDM, the requirements for on-street parking were found in the design standards as far back as at least the 1970s. So just to show you, here's the 1978 Traffic Operations Standards, which shows some on-street parking requirements, including a table that provides values for speed limits greater than 35 miles per hour. So we used to place on-street parking spaces on roads greater than 35 miles an hour. If you go on to search through the design standards, you'll also find that in 1987, this standard changed quite a lot, including the table. In '87, we created separate standards for signalized and non-signalized intersections, and also changed the speed limits shown in the table that only show up to 35 miles an hour, not 35 or more, which implies that we don't place on-street parking on roads with speed limits higher than 35. So the requirements stayed that way ever since 1987. When we developed the FDM, we actually put that speed limit requirement into words in FDM 210.2.3. The FDM clearly states that on-street parking is only allowed on facilities with a posted speed of 35 miles per hour or less. So now that we have some background on how our state has ended up with on-street parking on some roads with speed limits greater than 35 miles an hour, you can understand why we needed to add this new section in the FDM. So according to the new language, if you have on-street parking on a road with a posted speed greater than 35 miles per hour, then you need to process a design variation to keep those parking spaces. As part of developing the design variation, you may end up needing a variation for intersection sight distance and stopping sight distance as a result of keeping the on-street parking. All of these elements can be part of the same design variation package. You don't need to process 3 individual variations. Also, if your on-street parking within your project limits impacts more than one intersection, you can include all of those intersections in a single variation. So if you end up keeping the on-street parking, we'd also like for you to think about some mitigation strategies. If possible, see if you can implement any speed mitigation strategies from FDM 202, which is our speed management chapter. In addition to that, or if speed management techniques just aren't feasible for your project, see if you can squeeze in a 2-foot buffer between the parking spaces and the travel lane. The main concern here, of course, is the safety of the drivers getting in and out of the parked vehicles and having to contend with traffic moving by them at 40+ miles an hour. The next change is in figure 210.2.1, which is the figure showing our standard pavement cross slopes. The only change to the table was in the notes where we removed a conflict in item C of note 2. So note 2C says that we can use an 035 cross slope for 5 lanes sloped in one direction for all design speeds. However, note 5 tells us that we can only use 4 or 5 lanes sloped in one direction for design speeds of 65 or less. So the notes conflict, and this edit here takes care of that. The intent is to limit the use of 4 and 5 lane sections that are sloped in the same direction as described in Note 5. And if you have one that is a 5 lane section, the maximum cross slope you can use on the tangent sections is defined in Note 2C. FDM 210.4 is our section on shoulders, and we made a couple of small edits here. The first one is found in the text of the first paragraph, and as you can see here, we added a definition of paved shoulder. It was brought to our attention that we never actually defined a paved shoulder here in the section on shoulders, although we did elsewhere in the FDM. It was actually already defined in FDM 223, which is the bicycle facilities chapter. So we simply copied it over into FDM 210. So now our section on shoulders actually does define a paved shoulder, and it defines it as the portion of the roadway contiguous with the traveled way for accommodation of errant vehicles, stopped vehicles, bicycle traffic, and emergency use. The other change in the section on shoulders is the addition of a note in our standard shoulder widths table, which is table 210.4.1. Note 7 was added to avoid situations where we may have nearby concrete barriers that are located beyond the standard paved shoulder width, but not by much. If you were to only call for the standard paved shoulder width in these types of locations, you may end up with a foot or two of soil or grass between the pavement and the barrier. This is not desirable for our maintenance crews who would need to access this narrow area just to cut the grass. So instead, we would rather you call for the additional minimal width of pavement to butt up to the concrete barrier in this situation. In FDM 210.5.1, which is our section on high-speed curbed roadways, we did a little bit of cleanup here. Previously, the language said to provide an offset from the edge of traveled way to the lip of the curb, but it should have said to the lip of gutter. So this edit just fixes that terminology. The intent is not to change the offset requirements, we're just clarifying where to measure from. The section on horizontal alignment received some terminology and language improvements. Here we changed the term expected posted speed to more correctly say anticipated operating speed. And we also improved things in the subsection 210.8.2. Here we wanted to address driver's perception and not just sight distance. So now the sentence says that the combination of horizontal and vertical curves can negatively impact sight distance and can also greatly reduce the approaching driver's ability to perceive a horizontal curve ahead. This is not a change in our criteria, but it will hopefully clarify some things that need to be considered when you're laying out your horizontal curves. The section on 3R criteria for super elevation was basically rewritten, so it'd be too messy to try and look at the actual edits. Instead, let's start with taking a look at the previous language, and I'll describe the edits here, and then show you the new language on the next slide. So first, we removed the reference to requirements being in the standard plans. Requirements are only in the FDM. Next, we looked at the second paragraph to see if we could make some improvements. Here it says that if you have an existing curve that does not meet super elevation requirements, you need to do a crash study to see if there were any crashes that were attributed to the substandard super elevation in a 5-year period. Then, if there was more than one crash in this period that was determined to be related to the substandard super, then you had to correct the super elevation. This crash threshold is somewhat confusing because the next paragraph, item 1, says that you can leave the substandard super elevation if no attributable crashes have occurred in the past 5 years. So this is confusing. In the second paragraph, we say super elevation is required if there is more than one crash, but in item 1, under high-speed roadways section, we say that super elevation is required unless the 2 criteria are met, one of which is that there are 0 crashes. In the new version of this language, which I'll show you in just a minute, the big change is that we removed the 2 different crash thresholds and simply said that for all curves, if you have any crashes related to substandard super elevation in the past 5 years, you need to correct the super elevation. In addition to cleaning up the first paragraph and also removing the discrepancy about the number of crashes, we also fixed the section on high-speed roadways so that it reads more simply. Instead of saying to leave the super unless 2 conditions are met, we simply say what to do. Finally, we realized that we were completely silent on how to treat low-speed roadways. So in the new language, we added a section for that. So now that we see everything that needed to be fixed, Let's take a look at the new language. As you can see, we removed the reference to superelevation requirements being in the standard plans. The criteria is only in the FDM, so the only thing we need to reference here is section 210.9, which is the superelevation section. Here's where we fixed that second paragraph and simplified the number of crashes that would require superelevation correction. Now we clearly say for all curves, if there are any crashes in the last 5 years that were related to the substandard superelevation, you need to correct it to the values in tables 210.9.1 and 210.9.2, which are the new construction standards. Next, you see that we've added language for how to address low-speed curves. Remember, we were previously silent on this, so this language is brand new. The way we came up with this was by consulting each district roadway design office, and the consensus was that for curves on low-speed roads, so 45 miles per hour design speed or less, if the existing superelevation rate is within plus or minus 1% of the new construction values, then you don't have to correct the superelevation. If the existing superelevation rates are beyond that threshold, then you need to either correct the superelevation or else process a design variation to leave the deficient curve in place. Finally, you can see how we cleaned up the section for high-speed curves. We added ramps to this section because all ramps, regardless of design speed, need to meet the criteria for high-speed roads. You can also see here that we've restructured this section to simply say what to do instead of saying you can leave it in place unless you meet the following two conditions. That was clunky, so instead, now we tell you that if your existing curve is within the range of derived values from the Emacs 6% and Emacs 12% in the AASHTO Green Book, then you do not need to correct your super. The next bullet says that if you don't fall within that AASHTO range, then you should either correct the curve or else you'll need to process a design exception to leave the deficient curve in place. This is the same criteria as before, it's just said much more clearly now. And you'll also notice that we took out note 1 that talked about the number of crashes. This is still a requirement, but it's covered under the section above for all curves. So hopefully all these changes to this section have made it easier for you to figure out when you can leave an existing curve as is, when you need a variation, or when you need an exception. FDM 210.11 is the section on sight distance. As you know, there are many different types of sight distances, including stopping sight distance, intersection sight distance, passing sight distance, and decision sight distance. The previous version of this section didn't specifically define any of these terms. In fact, the third item in this list could imply either intersection or decision sight distance. The first two items in the list are pretty obvious, but the last one could be referring to a couple of things. So the idea behind this change is not to change our current criteria or add new criteria. It's simply to improve the language and be more clear with the elements that we're really describing here. So we added terms to the list, clarified item 3, and added a new item for intersection sight distance. So here's the revised language. You can see where we added in the terms in the appropriate locations, and also you'll notice where we added a definition for intersection sight distance. That new definition says that it's the sight distance needed by a motorist to see approaching vehicles before their line of sight is blocked by an obstruction near the intersection. Also, we added a couple of examples of complex locations to item number 4. Hopefully these changes just clarify what we mean. As we were making edits to this section, we realized that back when we converted the PPM into the FDM, we inadvertently left out some important information here for stopping sight distance. We left out the fact that the stopping sight distance values were based on an eye height of 3.5 feet and an object height of 6 inches. These values are no different from what we used in the PPM, but we just neglected to include it in this section when we created the FDM. Originally, the PPM only had a single section for sight distance and didn't break out into subsections to discuss stopping sight distance, intersection sight distance, or anything else. So when we broke up the different subsections, the language describing eye height and object height was only moved into the subsection for passing sight distance. So this edit just corrects an oversight and places the criteria back where it belongs. Now on to passing sight distance. Over the past year, we took a look at the passing sight distances in the 2011 AASHTO Green Book versus the values in the FDM. If you were to read the new text here in this section, you'd see that AASHTO updated their passing sight distance values in 2011 to shorter distances. If you were to look back through the years at passing sight distance values in the AASHTO Green Book and in the manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD, you would see that AASHTO values were roughly twice as long as the MUTCD values. However, in recent years, AASHTO performed research and determined that their values could be reduced to match what the MUTCD had. So now those two documents match. After much deliberation on this topic, we at the department came to the decision that we did not have a compelling reason to update our values here for new construction. We want to maintain the more conservative values for our new alignments. However, for resurfacing projects, we have now adopted the 2011 AASHTO values for our 3R criteria. So the table and the text edits shown here are all related to that issue. Finally, we added this small subsection just for reference purposes on decision site distance. This new subsection closes all of the vague gaps that we previously had in the manual on which site distance we were really talking about. AASHTO has a very in-depth discussion on decision site distance, and rather than try to bring any of that into the FDM, we simply refer the reader to Chapter 3 of the Green Book. And with that, I think I've covered all the updates to FDM 210, so thank you for your time and attention.